Welcome back to another sleepy journey through history. Tonight, we are going to explore strange and forgotten stories about how people lived, worked, and sometimes suffered in times long past. You will hear about daily struggles, curious traditions, and the kind of details that remind us how different life used to be before you get comfortable and drift off. Make sure you have hit the subscribe button and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city name and your local time in the comments so we can see just how far this little community of night owls reaches. When we think about Viking soldiers, the image that comes to mind is often one of fearless warriors, with horned helmets charging into battle under stormy skies. This image has been polished by centuries of sagas, Hollywood movies and popular culture. But if you were actually one of those Viking soldiers living in the 9th or 10th century, the story would have been much less glorious than what we imagine. The first thing to understand is that Viking soldiers were not professional troops. They were farmers, fishermen or craftsmen who took up weapons when called upon. Fighting was not their full-time job, but rather an extension of their survival. These men had to provide for their families and communities in harsh Scandinavian climates, where winters were long and unforgiving. This meant that when they were not raiding or defending their land, they were out in the fields, tending crops, repairing ships, or mending tools. The life of a Viking soldier was less about glory and more about hard work mixed with bursts of terrifying violence. The brutal training also made life hard. There were no formal academies or barracks for Viking soldiers. Instead, young boys were expected to learn how to fight from their fathers, uncles or older brothers. From a young age, they were handed wooden swords and shields and encouraged to play fight, which was essentially early training. These fights were not just games. They could result in broken bones or even death, because the line between training and actual combat was often blurred. Growing up in a Viking settlement meant violence was always close at hand, and you had to be prepared for it. Armor was another major problem. Contrary to the shiny images we see in shows and films, most Viking soldiers could not afford full suits of armor. A few wealthy chieftains and their closest warriors might have had chainmail, but most fighters went into battle with little more than a wooden shield, an iron helmet if they were lucky, and perhaps a leather tunic. The majority of their bodies were completely unprotected against enemy blades, arrows and spears. Imagine standing on the battlefield with only a round shield and a wool tunic facing a wall of armored soldiers from a better equipped army. The odds were rarely in their favor. Weapons were also limited. While some Viking soldiers carried iron swords, these were expensive and highly prized possessions. Only a small portion of fighters had them. The rest carried axes or spears tools that doubled as farm implements. These weapons were effective, but they did not always match the finely forged steel blades carried by their enemies. A Viking soldier with a simple axe had to rely on strength and courage to overcome foes who might be better equipped and better trained. Every strike mattered, and every mistake could cost them their life. The battles themselves were grueling. Raids often required long journeys by sea in cramped wooden ships. Soldiers had to row for hours, or even days across cold, stormy waters before arriving at their target. By the time they reached foreign shores, they were already exhausted. Hungry, cramped, and sometimes seasick, they had to leap into action immediately, facing enemies who were defending their homes. While the stories we hear make these raids sound like quick victories, many turned into bloody struggles where Viking soldiers were cut down before they could seize any treasure. Disease and injury were constant companions. Wounds in battle were rarely clean, and with no real medical knowledge, infection spread quickly. A cut from a rusty blade or an arrow lodged in the flesh could turn deadly within days. Amputations were crude and pain relief was minimal. If you survived a battle, with serious injuries, your chances of living long afterward were slim. Soldiers carried scars not as badges of honor, but as painful reminders of what they had endured. Even a simple broken bone could mean months of suffering and permanent disability. In a world where physical labor was essential for survival, the psychological toll was heavy as well. Viking soldiers were expected to embrace death without fear. They believed in Valhalla, the grand hall where warriors who died bravely in battle would feast forever. But not everyone truly believed or found comfort in that promise. Fear of dying far from home consumed many. For those who returned alive, the memories of screaming enemies, burning villages, and comrades cut down beside them stayed for life. What sagas do not tell us is how many Viking men struggled with the weight of those memories once they were back tending their fields or holding their children at night. Then there was the constant threat of betrayal. Viking societies were not united under a single king during much of the Viking Age. Instead, they were made up of competing clans and petty kingdoms. Soldiers often found themselves fighting, not just against foreign enemies, but also against rival Vikings. Power struggles between chieftains meant you could be asked to fight against your own cousins or former allies. Loyalty was fragile, and shifting allegiances meant soldiers were pawns in larger games of power. The glory of battle often masked the grim reality that Viking soldiers were expendable food, and resources during campaigns were another hardship. Armies had to rely on what they could carry or steal from raids. Longships did not have the space to carry weeks of supplies. Soldiers often went hungry, surviving on dried fish, hard bread, and whatever they could forage from the land they raided. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them more vulnerable to disease and exhaustion. A starving Viking soldier was hardly the fierce warrior described in stories, but rather a tired, hungry man just trying to survive another day. Finally, it is worth remembering that for every victory, there were countless defeats. The Viking Age stretched across centuries, filled with countless battles against Saxons, Franks, Byzantines, and other powers. Many Viking armies were wiped out in ambushes, crushed by larger forces, or scattered by storms at sea. A single successful raid could make a chieftain wealthy. But for the common soldier, the chances of dying anonymously in a muddy field far from home were much higher than earning lasting glory. The stories we know today were written by survivors or told by poets. Those who perished in misery never had their voices heard. So while the world remembers Viking soldiers as fearless raiders carving their legacy into history, the reality was harsher. They were men caught between survival and struggle, trying to defend their homes or earn enough wealth to feed their families. They carried wooden shields instead of shining armor. They rode across freezing seas instead of marching in disciplined ranks. They fought with axes that doubled as farming tools instead of polished swords. Their lives were full of hunger, disease, betrayal, and fear. The myth of the Viking warrior may live on, but for those who actually lived it, being a Viking soldier was rarely the glorious adventure we imagine. To understand why being a Viking soldier was far from glorious, we need to look closer at the lifestyle that came with raiding. Raiding was not just an occasional adventure, it was a necessity for many communities in Scandinavia. The land was rocky, the soil thin, and the climate unforgiving. Harvests often failed, and winters were long and brutal. The wealth and food supplies that raiding brought back were essential for survival. But this meant that men were pressured to fight, even when they might have preferred to stay home with their families. The expectation was clear: if you were strong enough to hold a weapon, then you were expected to row sail and raid. The journeys themselves were some of the hardest parts of being a Viking soldier. Longships may seem impressive to us today, but for those who lived in them, they were floating prisons. Soldiers had to sit shoulder to shoulder with little room to move. They rowed for hours on end, blistering their hands on the oars, while icy salt water splashed into their faces. Their clothes often stayed wet for days, leaving them shivering in the cold skies, could turn black with storms in an instant. And many soldiers drowned when their ships capsized or were wrecked on rocky coastlines. The sea was both their path to riches and their greatest enemy. When the ships finally reached foreign shores, there was little rest. Soldiers had to leap into action immediately. Charging ashore with shields raised, they faced angry defenders who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by surrendering. The first few moments of a raid were the most dangerous. A single mistake, like losing your footing on the wet sand or dropping your shield, could mean instant death. For Viking soldiers, this constant gamble of life and death became routine, and yet no amount of practice could ever make it less terrifying. Unlike the way popular culture paints them, Viking raids were rarely about heroic duels. Instead, they were messy, chaotic struggles. Soldiers rushed into villages, set fire to homes and barns, and tried to capture as much food, livestock, and silver as possible. Every villager fought back in whatever way they could, so Viking soldiers were constantly surrounded by danger. A farmer, armed with a pitchfork, could be just as deadly as an enemy soldier when the fighting closed in. And for every bag of treasure that was looted, countless Viking soldiers fell to blades, arrows, or even flaming torches in desperate defense. And once the violence ended, the hardships continued. The loot had to be carried back to the ships, which were often anchored far from the shore. Soldiers had to drag heavy sacks of silver livestock and supplies over long distances, while still keeping watch for counterattacks or ambushes. If enemy forces pursued them, the retreat to the ships became a nightmare. Soldiers loaded the longships as quickly as possible, while arrows rained down and spears flew into the water. There was no room for hesitation. A Viking soldier too slow to board might be cut down, or left behind to die life aboard ship after a raid was equally miserable. The treasures of victory did not immediately make life easier. Soldiers crammed back onto benches with whatever loot they had seized, but now they also had the burden of caring for wounded comrades. There were no doctors on board, and only the simplest forms of care could be offered. Soldiers with broken bones, bleeding wounds, or burns were left to groan in pain. As the ship rocked violently on the waves, infection set in quickly, and many did not survive the trip home. The smell of blood, sweat, salt water, and smoke filled the air, turning the long voyage into a test of endurance. Back home, there was little comfort. Either Viking soldiers were often celebrated for bringing wealth, but the glory was short-lived. Once the loot was divided among the chieftain and his followers, most common soldiers were left with little more than a small share, enough to feed their family for a short time, but not enough to lift them out of poverty. They were expected to return to their farms and resume the hard labor of daily life until the next raid came around. In truth, the cycle of raiding only briefly improved their lives, before plunging them back into the same struggles, and not every raid was successful. A failed raid meant disaster. Soldiers who survived had to face their families empty-handed. Worse still, they risked the wrath of their chieftain who had invested resources and reputation into the campaign. Soldiers might be blamed for cowardice or poor performance, which could damage their standing in the community. The social pressure to succeed was enormous, and many men felt crushed under the weight of expectations. Their worth as men was tied to how bravely they fought and how much they brought back. A single failure could brand a soldier as useless. We must also consider the toll on the mind. Constant raiding forced Viking soldiers into a world of endless violence. They watched villages burn, they saw children cry, they killed men who defended their homes, and they carried those images with them forever. The sagas describe warriors who laughed in the face of death, but reality was different. Many soldiers lived with unspoken guilt or nightmares, though their culture left little room for expressing weakness. To admit fear was to admit shame, so they carried their trauma silently, building a hardness that broke many from within. Another, often overlooked, burden was the treatment of captives. Viking raids were not only about stealing silver, but also about capturing slaves. Soldiers were expected to round up men, women and children to be taken back and sold into bondage. This was not a task that came easily. Soldiers who hesitated risked punishment, but those who obeyed were haunted by the cries of their captives. The wealth of the Viking world was built on this cruelty, and soldiers were the hands that carried it out for many. It was a moral wound that stayed with them long after the raid was over. So when we peel back the romantic stories, we find that the life of a Viking raider was exhausting, dangerous and thankless. Soldiers risked everything for rewards that rarely changed their lives. They faced drowning in icy waters, burning in enemy villages, or rotting from infected wounds. They carried guilt and trauma home, alongside meager shares of treasure. And they knew that once they had recovered from one raid, they would soon be asked to risk it all again. To be a Viking soldier was not to live a glorious life of endless feasting, but to endure a cycle of hunger, hardship, and peril that seemed to never end. When people imagine Viking soldiers, they often picture warriors who lived only for the clash of steel and the thrill of raiding. Yet the truth was that most of these men were also farmers, husbands, and fathers. The moment the raid was over, or the battle ended, they had to return home to a life of responsibility that was just as demanding as warfare. Being a Viking soldier meant balancing the burden of violence abroad with the struggles of survival at home, and this constant push and pull was exhausting in ways that history books rarely describe. A Viking household was not a quiet retreat, but a place of endless work. The farm demanded constant attention, whether it was planting barley, tending livestock, repairing fences, or collecting firewood. Viking lands were not naturally fertile, and so every meal came from sweat and back-breaking labor. A soldier might have returned from a raid with wounds still healing, but he would still be expected to help plow fields or carry heavy loads. The line between soldier and laborer was thin, and in truth they were both at once. There was little chance for rest or healing. Family life added another layer of weight. The sagas often glorify warriors, but they rarely mention the wives, children, and elders left behind. Every time a soldier went to sea, he knew he might not return. His wife was left to manage the household, the farm, and the safety of the family, without knowing whether she would ever see him again. If he returned empty-handed or wounded, his family would also share the consequences. This meant that the risk of battle was not carried by the soldier alone, but by the entire household. His sense of duty to his family clashed constantly with the duty to raid and fight for his community. The strain grew heavier because Viking society valued strength, courage, and the ability to provide a soldier who came home with treasure gained honor. But one who failed risked shame and whispers from neighbors. Reputation mattered greatly, and every man was judged not just by his bravery in combat, but by how well he supported his family and his chieftain. This constant social pressure created an invisible battlefield at home. Soldiers fought not only with swords abroad, but also with expectations at home. The fear of dishonor could weigh even more heavily than the fear of death. The seasons also brought their own challenges. Winter was particularly harsh in Scandinavia, and without enough supplies, entire families could starve. A Viking soldier might risk his life on dangerous raids across the sea, only to come back to a household facing hunger. He might have survived arrows and blades, yet be powerless against a failed harvest, or a disease that swept through the village. The contrast between the heroism of battle and the helplessness of home life was stark. For many men, the hardest battles were not fought on foreign shores, but within their own villages against cold and scarcity. Another difficulty was that returning soldiers often struggled to fit back into ordinary life. After months of violence, the quiet of farming could feel strange, but there was no choice. They had to put away their weapons, pick up their tools, and pretend that the horrors they had seen were behind them. The shift was jarring. Imagine rowing for weeks, fighting in bloody battles and watching friends die, then suddenly being expected to calmly repair a roof or tend sheep. Many soldiers carried invisible scars that made it difficult to feel at peace even when they were safe. This disconnection sometimes created tension within families. Soldiers who had seen violence up close might grow harsher, colder, or more distant. They had little room to express fear or sorrow because Viking culture demanded that men be stoic and fearless. This silence often built walls between fathers and children or husbands and wives. The very qualities that helped a man survive in battle could make it harder for him to be a kind and patient presence at home. In this way, the role of a soldier ate away at the fabric of family life long after the raids ended. Religious beliefs played a powerful role in shaping the burdens of Viking soldiers. The promise of Valhalla was meant to inspire courage. Men were told that if they died bravely, they would be welcomed into Odin's hall, where endless feasting and fighting awaited. But this belief also created pressure. Soldiers were expected to face death without fear to welcome it. Even if a man flinched or fled in battle, he risked losing not only his honor in life, but also his place in the afterlife. The weight of this expectation was enormous. Imagine being told from childhood that how you died determined your eternal fate. It left little room for weakness or doubt, and yet doubt existed. Many Viking soldiers must have secretly questioned these promises. Did every man truly believe he would feast in Valhalla? Or did some lie awake at night, wondering whether death would simply mean nothingness? These unspoken fears added another layer of hardship to their lives. For men who spent so much time facing death, the thought that all the sacrifice might be meaningless could gnaw at their spirits. Even if they never dared to say, it allowed community duties also could not be ignored. When a village was attacked, every able man was expected to take up arms. Not just those who enjoyed fighting. This meant that even men who were tired, wounded, or reluctant had no choice but to stand in the shield wall. The survival of the settlement depended on it. Refusal meant shame or worse, exile. A Viking soldier had to be ready at all times because danger might strike at any moment. There was no true off-season from the demands of warfare and home defense. The shield wall itself is another aspect worth considering. It was the primary formation used in battle. Soldiers stood shoulder-to-shoulder, shields overlapping in a wall of wood and iron. The success of the entire group depended on every man holding his ground. If one man faltered, the line could collapse, leaving everyone vulnerable. That kind of pressure was immense. A soldier was not just fighting for himself, but for every man beside him. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, and the fear of being the weak link haunted many. When we look at all these pressures together, the picture of Viking soldiers becomes clearer. They were not just warriors of myth, they were ordinary men bearing extraordinary loads. They carried the expectations of their families, the demands of their farms, the hopes of their communities, and the crushing weight of their own fears and doubts. They had to balance the brutality of raids with the endless responsibilities of home life. They were celebrated in sagas, but in reality, their lives were defined by hardship, exhaustion, and unrelenting duty. The myth of the fearless Viking warrior tells only half the story. Behind every raid was a man who longed for rest. Behind every victory was a family left to worry if he would return. Behind every shield wall was a soldier who carried not only a weapon, but also the weight of his entire community. The life of a Viking soldier was not one of endless adventure, but one of endless burdens. And in many ways, those burdens were heavier than any sword or shield they carried. When we imagine the battles Viking soldiers fought, we often think of dramatic clashes where heroes swung swords in shining armor. The reality could not have been further from that picture. Battles were messy, chaotic, and terrifying. Being part of one meant being trapped in a storm of noise, blood, and fear. A Viking soldier stood in a shield wall, pressed shoulder to shoulder with other men with little room to breathe, let alone swing his weapon properly. The clash of wood and iron echoed all around as shields splintered and men screamed in rage and agony. This was not a place of glory, but a place of survival. The shield wall itself was both the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of the Viking soldier. It provided protection against incoming arrows and spears, but it demanded that every man hold his ground without breaking. The moment one soldier faltered, the enemy could push through and tear apart the entire line. Standing there with arrows whistling overhead, an enemy, soldiers charging toward you, was an unbearable test of courage. A Viking soldier had to trust that the man beside him would not give in to fear because his own life depended on it. The pressure of that moment weighed heavier than the shield itself inside. The shield wall. The fighting was brutal and close. The weapons most Viking soldiers carried were simple axes or spears, which required strength and precision to use effectively. In the crush of bodies, strikes often missed their intended targets, or landed with only glancing blows. Soldiers slipped on blood-soaked ground, stumbled over fallen comrades, and fought desperately to stay upright. Many did not fall because they were defeated directly by the enemy, but because they tripped or were crushed under the weight of bodies. The battlefield was a place where chance and chaos played just as much a role as skill. The noise was overwhelming. Imagine the roar of men shouting battle cries, the clang of weapons striking shields, the thud of arrows piercing wood and flesh, and the constant screams of pain. A Viking soldier had to fight through this storm without losing his focus. Every sound was a reminder that death was only a heartbeat away. The sagas may describe these moments as epic contests of strength, but in reality, the experience was closer to drowning in a sea of fear, with no way to escape. But forward fear itself was a constant companion. Soldiers were expected to show bravery and to laugh in the face of death. But, deep down, many must have felt the icy grip of terror. They knew that one wrong move could mean their skull split open by an axe or their chest pierced by a spear. They were told that dying in battle would send them to Valhalla, but in the moment of combat. That promise was small comfort. The instinct to survive overpowered the dream of eternal feasting. For many, the thought of never seeing their family again was far stronger than the call of Odin. Wounds were not clean or quick. They were jagged and brutal. An axe did not slice smoothly like a sword, but crushed bone and tore flesh. A spear thrust could punch straight through a shield into a man's chest, leaving him gasping for breath before collapsing onto the ground. If you were lucky enough to survive a battle without being killed outright, you were still likely to carry scars for life. Many soldiers left the battlefield limping missing fingers or with faces marked forever by cuts. These were not symbols of pride, but reminders of the pain endured. Even those who survived with minor injuries were at risk. Infections were one of the deadliest enemies Viking soldiers faced. A small cut from a rusted blade could fester and turn deadly within days, without proper knowledge of. Medicine wounds were often cleaned with dirty water or packed with herbs that only sometimes helped. Amputations were done with crude tools and no anesthesia. Many men who survived the initial clash ended up dying in their huts days later, feverish and delirious. Their bravery in battle was meaningless against the silent, creeping enemy of infection. Psychological scars were just as real as physical ones. A soldier who saw his friends cut down beside him might never forget the sight. The smell of blood and burning villages could linger in his mind long after the fighting ended. The nightmares did not stop when the battle was over. They followed him back home as he lay awake listening to the wind outside his hut. In a culture that demanded silence about fear and sorrow, these men carried their memories alone. The laughter and drinking that followed victory often hid the haunted looks in their eyes. There was also the brutality of what soldiers themselves were forced to do. In raids, they were not just fighting armed men, but also villagers who resisted. Soldiers burned homes, cut down defenders, and took captives, including women and children. The violence was personal and up close. A soldier had to look into the eyes of the people he struck down. These actions were praised by chieftains as victories, but they left heavy stains on the souls of those who carried them out. Killing in battle was one thing, but raiding villages often blurred the line between survival and cruelty defeat was another constant shadow. The Viking Age was filled with both victories and crushing losses. When armies marched into foreign lands, they often found themselves facing better equipped and better organized forces. A single ambush could wipe out entire bands of raiders. Soldiers who managed to flee had to row home across the sea with the weight of failure on their shoulders. If they returned empty-handed, they faced not only shame, but also the anger of their chieftains and families. In defeat, there was no glory, only bitterness and fear of what came next. Even victory was hollow more often than not. The spoils of battle rarely lasted long for the common soldier. A few coins, a share of livestock, or perhaps a piece of jewelry was all he might take home in return for risking his life. Meanwhile, the chieftains and leaders grew rich on the rewards. Soldiers bled and died, while others enjoyed the fruits of their labor. It was a system where the ordinary man paid the price, while those in power reaped the benefit. This imbalance made the life of a Viking soldier not only dangerous, but also deeply unfair. When we strip away the myths of heroism and look closely at the reality of Viking battles, we see a life marked by pain, terror, and sacrifice. Soldiers fought not because they craved glory, but because they had no choice. They stood in muddy fields with axes in hand, not knowing if they would ever see home again. They carried wounds that never healed both on their bodies and in their hearts. The brutality of battle was not a path to honor, but a road paved with fear and blood. Being a Viking soldier was less about conquering and more about surviving a nightmare that repeated again and again. For Viking soldiers, survival was not only about what happened on the battlefield. It was a struggle that followed them every single day, even when the swords were sheathed and the raids were over. Life in Scandinavia during the Viking Age was tough, long before a man ever set foot on foreign shores. The cold climate, the poor soil, and the constant threat of hunger shaped their lives as much as any weapon did. Being a soldier was not a full-time role for most men. Instead, it was an extra burden, placed on top of the already crushing weight of survival. Farming was at the heart of Viking life, but it was not easy. The land was rocky, the growing seasons short, and the yields often small. Even in good years, there was little surplus, and in bad years, families faced hunger. A soldier might return from a raid with scars and exhaustion, only to be handed a plow and told to start tilling the fields again. His wounds might still ache, his muscles might still burn from rowing across the sea, but there was no time for recovery. Winter was always looming, and every man had to contribute or risk disaster for the entire household. Food shortages were a constant shadow over their lives. Meat was rare for the ordinary family, and most diets consisted of porridge-bred fish and whatever vegetables could be grown or foraged. For Viking soldiers, the problem was even worse. During campaigns, longships had very little space for provisions, so food often spoiled quickly. Soldiers ended up gnawing on hard bread, dried fish, or whatever they could steal or hunt in foreign lands. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, even as they prepared to fight battles. It is difficult to imagine glory when your body is weakened by constant malnutrition. Weather added another layer of difficulty. The Scandinavian climate was unforgiving, with freezing winters that lasted for months. Soldiers who were forced to fight or raid in the cold risked frostbite and hypothermia. Wet clothes froze against their skin as icy. Winds cut through their woolen tunics. There was little protection from the elements. A man could survive the strike of an enemy spear, only to perish in a snowstorm on the march back home. Nature was an enemy just as deadly as any rival warrior, and it claimed countless lives without leaving their names in any saga. Disease was another silent killer that haunted Viking soldiers. There was no understanding of germs or sanitation. Wounds were left untreated or crudely patched with herbs. Villages and ships alike were crowded with people and animals, making them breeding grounds for illness. A simple fever or infection could spread quickly, wiping out entire crews of raiders. Soldiers who shared benches on longships also shared lice, fleas, and disease. The sagas never mention the stench of sickness that hung over these voyages, but for the men who lived through them, it was a constant reminder that death lurked everywhere. The homes soldiers returned to offered little comfort. Viking. Houses were small, smoky and dark. Built of wood turf and stone, they were designed for warmth, but not for health. Smoke from fires filled the air, leading to constant coughing and lung problems. Soldiers who returned with weakened bodies found little relief in such conditions. The same walls that protected them from the wind also trapped the damp and the disease. A man who had survived steel and fire abroad could still die quietly at home from an illness that no one understood how to cure. Social expectations deepened these hardships. Men were judged by their ability to provide for their families and their community. A soldier who returned empty-handed from a raid risked being branded a failure. Even if he had fought bravely, it was the spoils that mattered. Families needed food and wealth, and neighbors respected strength more than stories. To be seen as weak was dangerous in a society that prized toughness above all else. A man might carry shame heavier than his shield if he failed to meet these expectations, and shame in Viking culture could be as crushing as any wound. There was also the constant cycle of preparation and recovery. Life never slowed down for Viking soldiers. When one raid ended, preparations for the next soon began. Ships needed repairing weapons, reforging supplies, gathering. A man barely had time to rest before being called upon again. He had to balance ploughing the fields with sharpening his axe, rowing practice with mending fences, tending to livestock with listening for the chieftain's call to arms. This endless rotation of duties left little room for peace or personal dreams. Every season brought new demands, and every demand was tied to survival. Mental strain was unavoidable. A soldier might sit at home eating with his family, yet his mind was still at sea, reliving battles or worrying about the next campaign. Nightmares of burning villages or fallen friends haunted him. When storms rattled the roof, he might remember the waves that nearly swallowed his ship. When he saw his children sleeping, he might feel the crushing fear of leaving them fatherless. These thoughts were rarely spoken aloud. Viking men were taught to endure in silence, but the silence itself only made the burden heavier. They carried wounds on the inside that no one could see. The divide between rich and poor widened this suffering. Wealthy chieftains and their closest warriors lived more comfortably, enjoying the finest loot from raids. They wore better armor, ate richer foods, and received the songs of praise that celebrated their deeds. Ordinary soldiers did most of the fighting, yet saw little of the reward. They risked their lives for scraps while their leaders grew powerful. This imbalance created resentment. Though it was rarely spoken aloud, chieftains held authority, and challenging them could mean exile or death. So soldiers bore the weight of injustice, silently adding bitterness to their already heavy lives. The cycle of violence itself became a trap. Many men fought because they had no choice. If they refused, they risked losing their land, their honor, or even their lives. Yet every raid brought only temporary relief. Hunger returned once the silver was spent. Families needed more, and so another raid was planned. Soldiers were caught in an endless loop where fighting was both their curse and their only chance at survival. Their lives were gambled again and again on seas and battlefields that offered no guarantee of safety. It was a treadmill of suffering with no end in sight. When we strip away the myths of longships slicing majestically through waves and warriors triumphantly raising their axes, we see the truth. Being a Viking soldier was not about adventure or fame. It was about enduring. Hunger, disease, cold exhaustion, and endless cycles of battle and labor. It was about carrying the weight of expectations while trying desperately to keep a family alive. It was about facing death not only in combat, but in every corner of daily life. Whether on a frozen sea or in a smoky hut, the struggle to survive never truly ended for Viking soldiers. Every story of a Viking soldier has two sides. On one hand, we remember the glory, their ships cutting across stormy seas, their fearless charges into battle, and the way they left their mark on Europe with fire and steel. On the other hand, behind this image of ferocity and strength was a life that was far from enviable. To be a Viking soldier was to live in constant tension, pulled between honor and hardship, ambition and suffering. When people imagine Vikings, today they often picture heroes of legend, but for the soldiers who lived it, the reality was filled with struggles that left their bodies broken and their lives cut short. This chapter is about the price of glory and why being a Viking soldier was far less appealing than it might seem. First, we need to look at the promises Viking men grew up with. From an early age, they were told that to be remembered forever, one had to fight and die with courage. The Norse sagas, poems and myths gave young men a vision of Valhalla, a great hall where warriors who died in battle would feast forever with Odin. This was the ultimate reward, an eternal banquet where one never aged or suffered. But while this idea inspired many to pick up the sword or axe, it also trapped them. Dying peacefully at home was considered dishonorable. Imagine being a soldier who survived countless battles but lived to old age. You would not be celebrated. Instead, you risked being remembered as a coward who failed to meet the warrior's destiny. This mindset meant soldiers were constantly pressured to take risks, fight dangerous battles, and sometimes even throw themselves recklessly into danger, all for the sake of a story told about them after death. But glory, even when achieved, came at a steep cost. The average Viking soldier lived a short life compared to others in his society. While farmers and craftsmen might see old age, soldiers often met their end in their 20s or 30s. And their deaths were rarely clean. Battle wounds could be brutal, slashes that left arms useless, blows that crushed ribs, or arrows that lodged deep into flesh. Even if they survived the fight, there was little in the way of medical care. Wounds became infected easily, and pain could linger for months. Some men returned home crippled, unable to work the land or fight again. Instead of glory, they faced shame and poverty. A man without strength was often left behind by a society that valued warriors above all. The constant raiding also wore on soldiers in ways that went beyond physical pain. They spent months at sea in cramped conditions, packed shoulder to shoulder, with others on longships. The waves tossed the ship endlessly, soaking clothes and supplies. Sleep was rare, food was rationed, and fresh water spoiled quickly. By the time they reached foreign shores, many were already sick, exhausted, or malnourished. To then face a battle immediately afterward only added to the suffering. For every raid that succeeded, many more ended in hunger, sickness, or death before even reaching the enemy. Another hidden cost of glory was the weight it placed on families. Soldiers who went off to raid left behind wives, children, and aging parents. For months, their families had no word of whether they were alive or dead. A wife might wait by the shore, hoping for the sail of her husband's ship, only to receive news that he had fallen in battle far away. Children often grew up with fathers who were gone more than they were present. And when soldiers died, their families could be left without protection or income. In some cases, raiding brought back wealth and treasures, but more often, the risks outweighed the rewards. For every soldier who returned home with silver and slaves, many others returned with nothing, or never returned at all. Then, there is the question of what glory really meant. While sagas and songs praised the great warriors, the average soldier was not remembered. A handful of leaders like Ragnar Lothbrok or Harald Hardrada became legends, but the thousands of men who fought and died at their side were quickly forgotten. For most Viking soldiers, their names never made it into the sagas. Their lives were spent chasing glory they would never achieve, dying on muddy fields far from home, with no one to carry their stories. Even Valhalla, the shining reward promised, to them was just a belief, not a certainty. Some may have died clinging to that hope, while others might have felt only fear in their final moments. Beyond battle, the reputation of Viking soldiers also came with consequences. While they were feared abroad, they were also hated. When villagers saw Viking sails approaching, they hid their food, burned their crops, and prepared to fight back with everything they had. Viking soldiers became symbols of destruction, not liberation. This meant that even in victory, they earned not love, but loathing. Captured soldiers could expect brutal treatment, torture, mutilation, or execution. Unlike the noble image of a knight in shining armor, a Viking soldier was often treated as a criminal or savage once caught. And yet, despite all this, many still took up the axe and shield. Why? Because for them, there was little choice. The society they lived in pushed them toward war. To refuse was to risk shame. To stay behind meant living as a farmer or servant, roles that were often undervalued. The warrior life offered at least the chance of riches and reputation, even if most never achieved either. It was a gamble, and for many, it was the only way to prove their worth. So when we ask why it was not good to be a Viking soldier, the answer lies in these hidden costs. Glory was dangled like a prize, but most who chased it found only suffering. Their bodies bore the scars of endless battles, their families carried the grief of loss, and their names faded into silence. For every story of Viking strength that survives today, there are countless forgotten men whose lives ended in pain and hardship. They lived in a world that demanded sacrifice, and while they gave everything, the rewards were few. And yet, their struggles should not be dismissed. The Viking soldier represents the harsh truth of history, that behind legends of bravery and conquest are real people who suffered greatly. Their story reminds us that glory often comes at a price far greater than we realize, and that the men who filled the ranks of Viking armies were not just warriors of myth, but human beings caught in a cycle of survival, honor, and hardship. In the end, to be a Viking soldier was less about living a glorious life and more about enduring a brutal one.